Father, we're thankful and grateful for teachers that study and present. We ask a blessing upon Chad and the blessing that he has been to us. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. I might switch it over to this. All right, where's the switch on that? All right. All right, looks like we got me mic'd up here. Good evening. How's everybody doing tonight? This was an interesting lesson to prepare for. When you start looking at the characters, some of them are easy to give a lesson on until you start looking at the context. David in itself, if we start thinking about Hebrews chapter 11, the great heroes of faith, David is fantastic. But when I look around and I see the banners up here that says family, I have to step back and kind of define what family is in my mind. And then I look at David and see what his family was like. And then all of a sudden, trying to put words on paper became a whole lot more difficult. First thing I had to do was sit back and I pulled out my Webster's dictionary and let's define family. It comes up, it's a basic unit in society, traditionally consisting of two parents rearing their children. Also, any various social units differing from, but regarded as equivalent to the traditional family, such as a single-parent family. You have the deal of a spouse and children. I want to spend more time with my family. A group of individuals living under one roof, a household. A group of persons of a common ancestry, a tribe, a clan. A people or group of peoples regarded as deriving from a common stock, such as a race. And those are pretty good definitions, but it really doesn't address what is a family. So I was sitting there going through the internet and I found a writer, and he put it out here. He says, what is a family? And this was his answer. The answer to this question, what does family mean, is both difficult to answer and highly subjective. The word has shifted its meaning considerably since it entered our language, and it currently contains many different senses, and at least one of these senses may signify different things to different people. The earliest use of family denoted a group of persons in service of an individual, a sense that is now archaic. Although this early meaning may seem far afield from the way most of us use family today, it's not surprising when you consider the word comes from the Latin familia, which meant household, a designation that included both servants and relatives. In modern use, family may refer to one of a number of different groups of people or things collectively, such as a chemical compound, related languages, plants, animals, people who may or may not share a combined ancestry. Family is often encountered in legal use, but even within the jargon of the law, it is not restricted to a single meaning. In many legal contexts, family denotes individuals related by blood, marriage, or adoption. But in others, the definition may be somewhat broader, encompassing groups of individuals not related to these things. When it got to things, I sat back and thought just what has happened this week. I was going to breakfast yesterday morning. Popeyes right down the street. It says, come join our family. I'm like, okay, I joined the family. Do I get a discount? Do I get to buy in some of the Popeyes retirement stock? And then coming home from breakfast, there was an ad on for the Oklahoma Highway Patrol. Come join our family. We're looking for a group of highly dedicated, physically fit, mentally stable, and moral individuals to join our family. But that's only going to be after an intense background check and 20 weeks of training. You can come join their family. When I joined the Air Force, it was only 6 weeks. It's up to 8 now, so it's a little bit more stringent there. I don't know if that's part of the family I want to be part of. The shedding of blood is also for a common purpose or persecution, unifies and solidifies the bonds of family. Probably one of my favorite documentaries on World War II is Band of Brothers. And it deals with the 101st Easy Company as they make their trek across Europe. It goes from their training to the end of the battle. And the Band of Brothers really comes from William Shakespeare's speech in Henry V. And Crispian shall ne'er go by, from this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy, few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother, but he never so vile, this day shall gentle his condition, And gentlemen in England, now abed, shall think themselves accursed that they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap while any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's Day. Family. It has different things, different meanings. There's different ways of becoming family. And within a family itself, you're going to have many titles. And a lot of these titles end up being interchangeable through the years. You'll be a son, a daughter, a brother, a sister, a mom, a dad, a grandmother, or a grandmother. In my house, that's Papa and Grandma for us. You'll also be an aunt. You can be an uncle or a cousin. And I can't ever stop when I hear the term cousin thinking about Christmas Vacation and Cousin Eddie. I'm sure we've all got a Cousin Eddie or two in our family. There's probably a cousin or Eddie or two sitting out here with us today. But it's there. When you get married, you will have in-laws. And of course, in my mind, it's like, okay, if you get divorced, do they become an outlaw? And you know, when we get to the LGBT and Q community, I don't even know how to address that. I don't even know that I want to know how to address it. But within each of these titles, they take on different roles and responsibilities. What you'll see in the Bible, families are known by their names. You will notice when an individual is introduced is that they are the son of, and as a Davy, it's the son of Jesse. You're known by your clan, by your tribe. Like I mentioned earlier, David is an easy study when it comes to a hero of faith, but he is much different in the boundaries of family. If I had to sit back and give this lesson a title, I would call it the good, the bad, and the ugly, because you're going to see all three of these in David's life. I've talked to many people, and a lot of them share this sentiment that in a lot of ways, David was a whiner when it got right down to it. He was extremely emotional, something I am not. He was not afraid to show his emotions. It didn't matter whether they were high or low. He leapt and danced before the ark as it was returned to the city of David. His wife, if you spell it out by the biblical pronunciation, is called Michal. But I'm going to use the 21st century version and call her Michelle because it's a whole lot easier to say. She was the daughter of Saul, and she scolded him, and it was in a pretty sarcastic tone if you look at it. It goes, "Oh, how the king has distinguished himself by dancing half naked in front of the slave girls as any vulgar fellow would do." His response to her was, "I will celebrate before the Lord and become more undignified than this. I will be humiliated in my own eyes, but as far as the slave girls, they will hold me in honor." God apparently agreed with David, and Michelle did not have any children to her death. At one point, he wept and fasted 7 days trying to intervene to save a son born illegitimately. The servants were afraid to tell him of the condition when the child died because of the way he was acting. He would compose many psalms, express guilt, remorse, joy. Matter of fact, he has contributed 73 of the psalms, with the possibility of 2 others he penned. David is known pretty much in the secular world too. If I bring up the deal, you always know David and Goliath. That story is pretty much known throughout. But he is also a very talented lyre musician, which is a small U-shaped stringed harp. He was chosen by God. He was an adulterer. He was a schemer. He was a murderer. He was a term all in, whether it was positive or negative. It reminded me of the letter to Laodicea in Revelations 3:14, which reads, "To the angel of the church in Laodicea write, these are the words of the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the ruler of God's creation. I know your deeds, that you are neither cold nor hot. I wish you were either one or the other. So because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I am about to spit you out of my mouth." There is no place for a lukewarm life of faith. With Davis, there was never a doubt. He was on fire. He was all in. But his greatest quality that we all know about is he was a man after God's own heart. Matter of fact, he is the only individual named in the Bible that is described as a man after God's own heart. And I had to stop and think, how do you define a man after God's own heart? And I had a tough time coming up with that definition. Luckily, Charles Swindoll helped me out on that. He's got a book on David called A Man of Passion and Destiny. And this is his definition. Seems to me, if you're a person whose life is in harmony with the Lord, what is important to him is important to you. What burdens him burdens you. When he says go to the right, you go to the right. When he says stop that in your life, you stop. When he says this is wrong and I want you to change, you come to terms with it because you have a heart of God. That's bottom line Christianity. When you are deeply spiritual, you have a heart that is sensitive to the things of God. A parallel verse in 2 Chronicles 16:9 confirms this. It says, "For the eyes of the Lord move to and fro throughout the earth, that he may strongly support those whose heart is completely his." Then in Acts 13:22, "I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do." Going back, we were first introduced to David in 1 Samuel. But before we get to David, let's go back and look at a little backstory. Samuel was one of the last judges for Israel. He had 2 sons, but they did not follow his ways. They turned aside and went after dishonest gains. They accepted bribes. They perverted justice. Israel saw the writing on the wall and they said, "We don't want his sons. We want a king." All the other nations have kings. We want a king. So Israel asked Samuel to appoint a king. 1 Samuel 6:6. "But when they said, 'Give us a king to lead us,' this displeased Samuel, so he prayed to the Lord. And the Lord told him, 'Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you that they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. As they have done from the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights.'" They were warned. There is a penalty and there's going to be a cost for having a king. He will take your sons. He will take your daughters. He will take your field. He'll take your property. He'll tell you what you will do. He'll tell you where you will live and what you will do. He will enlist your sons into his armies. One of the talk show radio hosts I listen to is Dana Loesch, and I believe that's how you pronounce her name. She has a show called The Dana Show. And one of the phrases she uses quite often, it says, "I am not a servant, I'm a citizen." Israel just asked to become a servant. They were a citizen of Israel, but they've asked to become a servant of a king. Let that think in for a second. But that is what they wanted, and God allowed it. It's a word of caution right there. Be careful what you ask for. You might just get it. So this introduces us to Saul. He will be anointed as the first king. 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 2. "Kish had a son named Saul, as handsome of a man as can be found anywhere in Israel. And from his shoulders upwards, he was a head taller than anyone else." I'll stop right there. Have you ever noticed how many Old Testament characters are described as beautiful or handsome and former of appearance? Think about Joseph, Rachel, Rebecca, Esther, Saul. David was described as ruddy, tall, dark, handsome, with beautiful eyes. His son Absalom was said not to have a blemish from the top of his head to the bottom of his foot. Let me rephrase that. I can't answer for you, but I won't. But I will answer for me. Somewhere along the line, I think I got the short end of the stick here. I think he used up all that in the Old Testament. But these were people that were believed as beautiful. But anyway, Saul has been appointed as the first king, chosen by God. But guess what? He couldn't keep from tripping over his own feet. When it was time for him to be presented to Israel, he went and hid in the luggage. He was afraid to come forward. Then he would end up making one mistake after another. Pride and impatience were probably his Achilles heel. He failed to wait for Samuel to present offerings, and because of this, the Lord took his kingdom away. 1 Samuel 13:14 reads, "But now your kingdom," talking to Saul, "shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. And the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." Samuel was mourned for Saul and what had happened. And the Lord asked Samuel, "How long will you mourn? I rejected him as king, but I have selected another. So fill your horn with oil and head to Jesse of Bethlehem, because I have chosen him." I've chosen one of his sons to be the king. Now Jesse was the son of Obed and the grandson of Ruth and Boaz. He was from the tribe of Judah. He was a farmer, a breeder, an owner of sheep. Jesse had 8 sons and 2 daughters. Think back, what was one of the biggest perks of being the oldest male child? Yeah, you got the first blessing, you got the inheritance, and you would usually take over as patriarch. So there's a lot of importance being put on that. Double portion of the inheritance and the first blessing. And really, when I thought about that, think of the struggle between Jacob and Esau and what happened there. David was the youngest of his brothers. So this would have not naturally fallen in line with him. As a brother, I would say that there was probably sibling rivalries. And depending on what your birth order is, your view as to who had it easier or best might differ. Now, with the many oldest child brothers and sisters I have out there, we know we had it the worst because we were experimental. There's some hands going up. We also figured out real quick that what rules I had were different than the younger one, and I'm sure there was probably a few instances like that there. Later on in text, we're going to see David's older brothers belittling his position. But let's get back to Jesse as a father. As a father, he held great responsibility, as all of us that have children do. He was a husband. He was a provider. He was a role model. He was responsible for teaching, for training. He gave the example of what a husband should be, what a father should look like. He would have been the one to taught his sons how to worship and follow God. The most effective way of teaching anything to anybody is by demonstrating it in your whole life or in your own life. Jesse's grandson Solomon would pen these words, Proverbs 22:6, "Train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it." I don't know if Solomon knew his grandfather or not, but I think Jesse tried to instill these values into his children. If you take a military term, he trusted and empowered his children. So what would David's childhood look like? We know he was the youngest, and when he was first mentioned, he was alone, out in the fields, protecting his father's flock. He was shepherding. And there's no reason in my mind to believe that his brothers had not followed the same path, that they had spent time out there, that they had learned the same lessons that he did. So when you're in a field, you spend a lot of time alone. You're out there with a sheep. Sheep are sheep. You can talk to them, but they're necessarily going to talk back. There's going to be some lonely times. They're not conversationalists. So what do you do to pass your time when you're out there? You really reflect on some of the things you've been taught. What did Jesse teach him about the Lord? You also do things to pass time. He was an instrument player. He played the lyre. Where do you think he found the time to master this skill? He also used a sling. Where was this time mastered? I grew up on the outskirts of Amarillo, and luckily where I lived, it was open fields behind us. And anytime we had the chance, we were out there. We had pellet guns, we had bows and arrows, we had the wrist rockets. And I don't even want to think to how many birds were killed out in that field by us refining our skills, but we were good shots. But it served as a purpose. David's time shepherding served as a purpose. That's where he refined his skill on using that sling. That's where he refined his skill on becoming a musician, which will all come into play later. You also, when you're out there, kind of mentioned, you reflect on the things you've been taught. My stepfather, he trucks for Walmart. And, after you've been on the road for so many times, you can only listen to so many radio shows, listen to so many books, you get bored. So what he decided to do was memorize the books of the Bible, starting at Genesis and going to Revelation. He took that time and mastered that. After that point, he went from Revelation to Genesis. It's because you had the time to get that down. I can't do it either way. But all right, let's go to 1 Samuel 16. Samuel has traveled to Bethlehem, to Jesse's home. Jesse and 7 of his sons were invited to the sacrifice. Samuel looked upon Eliab, Jesse's firstborn son. He was sure that he was the one God was going to choose as king. After all, he was Jesse's firstborn. and this is the one that you would assume would fill that headship role. But from what we read, Eliab seemed more to possess Saul-like qualities. 16:6, when they arrived, Samuel noticed Eliab and said to him, "Surely here before the Lord stands his chosen king." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Don't be impressed by his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him." God does not view the way men do. People look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So we could rightly consider that Eliab was the tall, dark, and handsome. He was tall. He was strong. He looked like a leader. He's what a leader you wanted to look like. But when he was presented, God told Samuel, no, not him. So Jesse had his other 6 sons presented before Samuel. Number 2, no. 3, no. 4, 5, 6. All of them that were standing there were rejected. So Samuel's sitting there scratching his head. He looks over at Jesse. "Do you not have any more sons?" Well, I don't know. Did Jesse forget about David? Or did he just not consider him? From what I've read, most people think that he was too young to be considered to go to the sacrifice. That's why he was still out in the field. But Jesse said, "Yes, I've got one more son. He's out in the field." And Samuel said, "Well, guess what? We're not sitting down. We're not doing nothing until we'll go get him." So they went out to get him. It's only after all the other options were presented did David's names arise. When David was summoned, it was upon him that God indicated to anoint. Samuel anointed David, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon him in a mighty way. This was done in the presence of Jesse and his brothers. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall to see how his brothers responded to that. I'm sure as a father, he was elated. But his brothers, you've got to be kidding me. This little brat, he's the one you're going to anoint as king? No way. So David selected as king. So what happens to him next? He gets taken up to Saul, goes through a coronation, grand ceremony, all the pomp, all the circumstances, right? No, not at all. From what we read, David went right back out to the field. None of this settled on him. The next time we read about him, it says, "At the same time that the Lord descends on David, it departed Saul, and an evil spirit of the Lord tormented him." I'm just curious to how they knew that was an evil spirit that was tormenting Saul. But anyway, Saul's servants recognized it as an evil spirit, and they said, "You need to find someone who plays the lyre, and this will calm you, and you will feel better." Starting in 1 Samuel 16:17. So Saul said to his servants, "Provide for me a man who can play well, and bring him to me." One of the men answered, "Behold, I have seen son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a man of good presence, and the Lord is with him." Therefore Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, "Send me David your son, who is with the sheep." So after being anointed, he went back out and continued to be the young shepherd boy. He did not he was humbled. He continued in the role he was at, even though he knew he was selected to be the king. Well, anyway, they go get him. David arrives, and the music soothes Saul's torments. So at this point, David is a young boy. We would assume that his only resume is shepherd, not a whole lot to put on it. But that time as shepherd served him well. And now his time serving Saul will serve him well as well. He will learn the ways of becoming a king. He can observe how Saul ruled, learn the royal etiquette that's involved. He would have seen what worked, what does not work in the kingdom. He was also appointed as Saul's armor bearer. He was taught how to be a warrior, a military leader. This was on-the-job training. This was as close to the king as anybody could get. And during this time, after he was appointed to play the music for Saul, to be his armor bearer, he would still leave the king's house, go back out to his father's field and watch the sheep. He was serving 2 roles. He was still serving his family, and he was serving the king. Even though he was anointed to be king, he now directly served him. During this time, they were also fighting. And David was home, and his father came up to him and goes, "I want you to go check on your 3 older brothers." They had followed Saul into battle. And what I found interesting there was it says they followed him into battle. They were not drafted. They went on their own. So Jesse, concerned, sends David up there to check on his brothers. David arrives to the scene as Goliath was coming into camp, and he came up there to taunt the Israelites, as he had been doing for the last 40 days. And I kind of went on a little rabbit trail here, and it's like, you ever thought and noticed how many times the number 40 has been mentioned in the Bible? Noah, 40 days rain. Moses, 40 days on the mountain. The spies in the promised land were there 40 days. Then they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus was fasting and tested for 40 days. And then if you look at the rule of Saul, David, and Solomon, they all served as king for 40 years. I just thought that was interesting. You see that 40, and it all numbered just keeps coming over and over and over. And I know that has absolutely nothing to do with the lesson. I can go on my own rabbit trails. But anyway, we go back. We're at this 40th day of Goliath's taunting. David comes in. He hears this Philistine giant just mouthing out these threats. And he looks around and goes, why is nobody fighting this guy? And what will happen to the person that slays him? And it was a pretty good deal. Your family will pay no more taxes, and you will get to marry the king's daughter. You become part of the royal court. David's oldest brother overhears him asking this question, and this is his response to David. This is 1 Samuel 17:28. When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him, and he asked, why have you come down here, and whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You come down only to watch the battle. Sense a little animosity? A little bit of disdain? Or maybe it was just flat outright jealousy of him. It's obvious his brothers don't view David as God sees him. Well, David takes his time and he convinces Saul that he is the man for the job. He says, I have killed lions and bears, protecting my father's sheep. When they would carry one off, I would go after it, strike it down, rescue the sheep from its mouth. I don't know how many of y'all have been in the wilderness and have come upon a bear that's not behind a closed cage. It is intimidating. Black bears are not that big, but they will still unnerve you. If you come across a brown bear, which is what should have been outside of Bethlehem, they are larger. They're intimidating. They're fearful. David was a young man. Even me, as a 50-year-old man, I don't want to confront a bear without a high-powered weapon. But it says he went after it, and he would rescue the sheep from its mouth. He was brave. He was trained. And he convinced Saul that he was the man for the job. And Saul agreed. Why he would do it, I don't know, but I think that says as much about Saul's character as it does David's. Well, anyway, David goes on. He slays Goliath. Again, his 3 older brothers are there. I want to see the look on their face. What did they have to say after that? But there was nothing. But I'm fast running out of time, so I'm going to jump up a little bit here. David ended up being a commander for Saul. He became a great commander. It was so great that Saul was jealous of him. The people were singing, Saul has killed thousands, but David has killed his 10,000. So Saul's jealousy got the best of him. He wanted David dead. And so he did everything he could to kill David. But there was another part of the family there, Jonathan, Saul's son. Jonathan and David became friends. They became more than friends. It says they loved one another. And not the love that the leftist point of view wants to bring out, but a deep brotherly love. Jonathan would end up taking David's side against his father. You do not have to be blood to be family. You can choose who your family is. And one of the things we learn from that is family keeps promise to one another. It had come to a point, Saul was gone. Jonathan was dead after a battle. And David had remembered a promise he made that he would keep somebody in Saul's kingdom alive and that he would honor them. And he did this. He found one individual who was lame, Mephibosheth, which I probably messed that name all up, but he ended up granting him to a position and returning some of Saul's land to him. He stood behind his word. But what we've seen so far is a lot of the good in David's life. Now we need to take a look at the bad and the ugly. It says David's sons have grown up, and from what you know in Scripture, there were 19 of them named. The first 6 sons were born in Hebron, and they were all born to different mothers. Can you see a possibility of a little tension? possibility of having favorites. It was said Absalom was his favorite. I guess David would probably be like I would. I would like to be able to go back and have some do-overs in my life. And I imagine the first do-over he'd want to do had to deal with Bathsheba. David had stayed home. He should have been out in the field fighting battles, but he had not. He lived, kind of settled into a life of leisure and pleasure. He was bored one night. He went up to his rooftop, and he noticed a beautiful young woman out bathing on the rooftop. He looked upon her. He desired her. He wanted her. He ended up having her. He took her into his bed. Now, this could have been stopped if he had been doing what he was supposed to have done. If he would have distracted himself. Maybe it was time to pick that sling up again. Maybe it's time to refresh on that heart, but he did not do that. He continued to look on. He asked who it was. Well, that's the Bathsheba. She's the wife of Uriah. Uriah was one of his commanders. Again, that should have been a point right there. We stop. This is one of your soldiers' wives. You don't have a right to her. But that didn't stop him. He took her. Had the night with her, and then she went home. A little bit of time later comes up. He gets word back. Bathsheba is now pregnant with his child. So David comes up with this ruse in his mind. Well, I will send for a report from the field. I'll get Uriah to bring it to me. Uriah comes in. He gives him the report. David says, go, spend the night home with your wife, and then you can go back to the battle tomorrow. Uriah does not do it. He sleeps in the doorstep of the palace. David finds out about it and goes, why didn't you go see your wife? And he says, why should I go spend time with my wife when my men are in the field? That should have pricked David's heart right there. That should have struck a chord. But David says, okay, just stay warm tonight. You'll have dinner with me. We'll have drinks. And his intention was maybe get him drunk and he'll go and want to be with his wife. But that did not happen. So David sends him back, but he also sends back the word to have him killed while he's in battle. David ends up scheming and he murders Uriah. After that, he brings Bathsheba up as his wife, and all turns out well. Does it not? No, not at all. And one of the writers put it this way: a bitter harvest started with Bathsheba's newborn child. An innocent baby died for the sin of David, and a threefold punishment starts. Because David despised God's commands by murder and adultery, he was told, the sword shall not depart from your house. I will raise up adversity against you. I will take your wives. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all of Israel. The child also who is born to you shall surely die. And what I find interesting, if you go down to 2 Samuel 12, verse 18, this is God talking to David. I also gave you your master's house, your master's wives into your care. I gave you the house of Israel and Judah, and if that had been too little, I would have added to them many more like these. The Lord didn't care that he had more. He just didn't want him to have what did not belong to him. All David had to do was ask. Well, David pleaded, he fasted and prayed for the child born to Bathsheba to not die. This went on for 7 days. The child finally died. He got up, cleaned himself up, and got something to eat. His servants had watched him for the last 7 days, and they go, why? Why is your attitude so different? You've lost your child. And David replied, I did everything I could while he was alive. But there's nothing I can do now. And he gave this beautiful explanation here. It says, I shall go to him, but he will not return to me. David lose 3 sons in his life. This one he accepted after trying to intervene. One of the sons he was angry with, but he took no action. And when he was killed, there was no emotion. And for one, he openly broke down. And hopefully I can get to that before we run out of time. I think another do-over he would like to do is his involvement with his children. As a military commander and his time running from fleeing for his life, he did not spend much time at home. He was not a visible example of what a husband should be. I don't think he provided his children with the training that Jesse provided him. There was a shortfall. He was an absent father. He was spread thin when he was there, and when he was there, he failed to prepare or instill any type of moral code. And with his father's presence not being there and what influence he had shown, it cast a negative effect. And it manifested itself in a couple of his children. Look at the story of Ammon and Tamar. Amnon is a half-sister. Well, let me rephrase that. Amnon is a half-brother to Tamar, and Absalom was her full brother. Tamar is described as being beautiful and a virgin, and Amnon was absolutely infatuated with her. He wanted to have her no matter what. And with the help of some devious friends, he figured out a way to do it. He tricked her into his bed or into his home. He ended up raping her. After he raped her, that love and infatuation turned to hate. He kicked her out, locked the door. Not long after that, his brother, Absalom, which would have been Tamar's full brother, found out about it. It says David found out about it. You know what David did? He became angry, but he didn't do anything. Absalom knew his father had found out about the rape, and nothing happened. He waited for 2 years. After 2 years, nothing happened. Then Absalom commands his servants, go kill him. They went and killed him. Absalom had to flee. He fled for 3 years, and then when he was invited back, it was 2 years there, but he wasn't able to go before the king. During those 2 years, he decides to take it upon himself. I'm not having open revolt against David. And so he went and sat at the city gates, and he became this professional politician. If only I could be appointed judge, I would rule rightly for you. And he started turning the hearts and the men of Israel against David. And when he had done this to enough, he got enough people behind him. He rampaged the city, and David fled. And David mourned for his son Absalom and what he had done. But it never said once that he mourned for Amnon, who was killed by him. What we have here is a tale of a father who was ineffective. He had had a great childhood. He had had a good example. He had been given anything that he wanted. He was very successful in what he had done. But when he got time to instill those values onto his children, he fell short. So Absalom, actually, I'm going to stop with this right here. I found this phrase on the internet the other day. And it says, if you raise your children, you get to spoil your grandchildren. If you spoil your children, you get to raise your grandchildren. And that's true in a lot of ways. But I really don't want this to end on a very negative note. At the end of David's life, there was a lot of other distractions going on around it. But we got time to anoint Solomon, who David's going to teach us about next week. He brought him in. And I'm just going to read you, it's 1 Kings chapter 2, starting verse 1. When David's time to die drew near, he commanded Solomon his son, saying, I am about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong and show yourself a man. And keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn, that the Lord may establish his word that he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons pay close attention to the way, to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart, with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. And we'll stop with that right there. Thank you for your time.